Greetings everyone. This is either going to unite my viewers or divide you guys, but here goes. I think it's pointless to argue about what's canon and what's not canon in a fictional franchise. Now, I have my own thoughts about the different Star Wars continuities, and this meme that you have in front of you perfectly summarizes how I feel about the whole canon debate in terms of Star Wars. On the left-hand side, you've got the macho dog, and in case you're not fluent in Spanish, don't worry about it, I will translate this for you. On the left hand, above the dog, it says Star Wars Before, basically referring to Star Wars when George Lucas was in control of it. And underneath it says it had a variety of eras. It talked about the Rakuten Empire, the Sith Empire, the Mandalorian Empire. It had various wars, the origin of all of Luke's descendants, and the ancient Sith. Now when it talks about the ancient Sith there, it's talking about characters like Darth Bane, Darth Zana, Revan, Malak, etc. It's basically saying that the original version of Star Wars, which is my preferred version, the George Lucas version, everything before Disney took over, talked about a variety of eras, and it was a very diverse set of characters. Meanwhile, on the right-hand side, with the obedient beta male dog, it says Disney Star Wars. It says, I am stuck in the Rebel era, and I only have Darth Vader. And that perfectly exemplifies it. Everything in the new version of Star Wars is all about the Empire and the Rebels. Pretty much nothing else. It doesn't really delve into a lot of other source material. It's very narrow in scope. And that is the downfall of the Disney canon, that and all of the pointless retcons. But regardless of which canon you prefer, whether you prefer the Disney canon or the Legends canon, or I like to call it just the original version of Star Wars, we can all agree it's just fiction. Now, different people call different things canon, but one thing that really gets under my skin is whenever a new version of a franchise comes out, people want to hurry up and say that the old version is not canon. When Dragon Ball Super came out, people wanted to say, oh, GT's not canon. When Disney's Star Wars came out, people said, oh, the expanded universe is not canon. And what I don't understand is, why does it have to be an either or? Why can't it just be a both and? Let's just back up and consider the facts here. George Lucas and all the people that created the older continuity of Star Wars, at the time of them releasing those products, they had the legal right to sell those things as Star Wars. So it was official Star Wars. Just like now, Disney is the one that has the legal right to sell their product as Star Wars. So what Disney is now selling is official Star Wars. So why can't we just say that there are two Star Wars universes? When you look at Marvel or DC Comics, they have multiple continuities. There's Earth 512, Earth 616, etc. Why can't Star Wars be like that? There's Tatooine 1 and Tatooine 2. Why does everything have to become a toxic fan war on Reddit? Why can't we all just get along and say, this is the version I like, and this is the version you like, and because they're both official versions, we can just agree that they're both official and not just try to piss on each other for having different preferences. And that's why I am releasing what I like to call the multi-author multiverse theory, or you can just call it MAMU for short. And I'm going to read this to you. I came up with this. Whenever a work of fiction has more than one writer, consider each writer's work as a separate continuity within the multiverse of that franchise. In other words, George Lucas wrote certain parts of Star Wars. Kathleen Kennedy, or whatever her name is, who wrote the sequel trilogy, wrote certain parts of Star Wars. And then after that, you have Dave Filoni. He's got his version of Star Wars. We can just say those are three different versions of Star Wars. We don't need to get into a flame war over which Star Wars is the official Star Wars. Underneath it, I have my definition of canon. And I say canon is fictional material published by the individuals that are legally authorized to use the franchise title. In other words, if that individual is legally authorized to sell their product as that franchise, they should have the right to call it canon. For example, when Genndy Tartakovsky made the 2003 Star Wars Clone Wars cartoon, that those of you who are over 30, you remember that? that was legally his right to sell that as Star Wars. He had the right to work under the Star Wars label. So that's canon. But you know what? So is Dave Filoni's Clone Wars. And yes, they contradict each other. That's okay. It's just two separate continuities. Whenever a fictional franchise gets a ton of writers, you're going to get a ton of different versions of that character. Think about Superman. You've got pre-crisis Superman, post-crisis Superman, New 52 Superman, Justice League Unlimited Superman. You have a million Silver Age Superman. You have a million different types of Superman. They're all Superman. They're all official Superman. And one is not more legitimate than the other. The only time where it's not a legitimate version is if it's fan fiction. That's why I say this includes books, games, and movies, but excludes fanfics. Let me give you an example. My videos are fanfics. They are not canon because I don't legally have the right to call my product an official Star Wars release. It's more or less a commentary on Star Wars, or you could even call it a parody, just like with Dragon Ball. Team 4 Star is not canon, but Dragon Ball Z is canon, Dragon Ball Kai is canon, and the Dragon Ball manga are all canon. They're three different continuities, but they are all canon, but Team 4 Star is not, because those guys do not have the legal right to call their product an official Dragon Ball product. So this would hopefully instill some peace into the Star Wars fan base and all the other fan bases I'm going to touch. If we just use the MAMU, the multi-author multiverse theory, whenever a series gets more than one writer, just consider it a different continuity. Even with your favorite TV show, writers change from time to time, and you might see in season 5 the character that you love is completely different in personality, talks differently, acts differently. Maybe they casted a different actor to play that character, and that's okay. That's just a separate continuity, just like Superman and Spider-Man and Wolverine and the Hulk have all these different continuities. TV shows and movies and video games can have different continuities as well. I personally consider the original Resident Evil 2 video game that I grew up playing a completely different continuity than the Resident Evil 2 remake, in which they made Claire Redfield somehow uglier than she was before. I don't understand how they messed it up. Or I grew up with Resident Evil 3, the original version, where Nemesis is jumping through the walls, shooting at you with the rocket launcher, and when he transforms into his mutated forms, it actually makes sense. But he was just a cool, shadowy figure in a dark trench coat. But the Resident Evil 3 remake, or the Resident Evil 3 remake, is just a giant hulking mess and he's wearing trash bags, for crying out loud. There's no way those two are going to mesh together. So I would consider the remakes to be in a different franchise than in the originals. And there's nothing wrong with that. You just have different versions. In fact, when you have a multiverse within a franchise, it makes it more interesting because then you can start to speculate. Who would win a fight between the original version and this version over here? For example, Padawan Anakin from the 2003 Clone Wars versus Padawan Anakin from the Star Wars The Clone Wars, or he was a Jedi Knight at the time, but you get the idea. Now, let me tell you a little bit about myself and my opinions when it comes to the Star Wars canon or the Star Wars background. So, when I was a kid, the first Star Wars film I ever watched all the way through when I was young was The Empire Strikes Back. Darth Vader made such an impression on me. He was such a cool character. He was very badass. He was hardcore. Remember that scene where Captain Needa went to apologize to him, and the next thing you see is Captain Needa being strangled to death on the floor, and you hear Vader say, "Apology accepted, Captain Needa." That was just amazing. Darth Vader made such an impression upon me. In fact, he's one of my favorite movie villains. He made such an impression upon me that I made this YouTube channel after Darth Vader. That's how much he's my favorite character. And for me, that era of Star Wars had the greatest influence on my childhood video game and movie experience. So for me, I prefer the George Lucas era of Star Wars. By the time Disney took over, I was already an adult, I already had grown-up responsibilities, and I did not really have the same amount of time to focus on the newer version of Star Wars. So for me, I consider this to be Star Wars. This right here is the original continuity of Star Wars. Now I know that's a lot of Star Wars right there, but don't worry, I'm going to break it down. For me, before the main movies, you've got Knights of the Old Republic and several novels that cover the ancient Sith. And then you have the mainline movies themselves, but of course I'm talking about just the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy. But between the movies, you have the 2003 Clone Wars and the Force Unleashed series of video games. But then after the movies, you have Luke becoming a Jedi Grandmaster. You have one of Leia's sons that she had with Han Solo becoming evil and becoming Darth Caedus, and you have the one Sith and Darth Krayt and all of those things. So to me, that's Star Wars. That's the version of Star Wars I prefer. It's a self-contained story. You know what happened before the movies, you know what happened between the movies, and you know what happened after the movies. So for me, that's Star Wars. And if this is what you consider Star Wars, if you prefer the Rogue One, the Mandalorian, Han Solo, the sequel trilogy, all that, if that's your version of Star Wars, okay, we just like two different versions of Star Wars. It doesn't make your version more official than mine. It doesn't make my version more official than yours. That's just my Star Wars is the original version. Yours is the newer version. They're both legally allowed to be sold as Star Wars because of the contracts that George Lucas signed. They are both official. Making something new official doesn't mean the old thing is no longer official. You may like a Luke that just becomes a hermit and just gives up on the franchise. I prefer a Luke who tapped into his potential, became Grandmaster, and became so powerful he was able to go toe-to-toe with the Emperor and defeat him. This is your Star Wars, but this is my Star Wars. But I respect both versions. If there are aspects of the Disneyverse that I like, I'm going to mention them. If there are aspects of the Legends version or the original version that I like, I'm going to refer to that as well. For example, in my video titled, What If Qui-Gon Had Killed Darth Maul on Tatooine, if you notice, at the end of that video, I mentioned Nomi Sunrider, but she's from the original Legends continuity. But I also have Ahsoka Tano in the video, and she's from the Disney version, and that's because I actually like Ahsoka Tano's character. I think that she was well written, and I appreciate what she brings to the table, just like I appreciate what someone like Nomi Sunrider would bring to the table. It's a both and. It's not an either or. What we can all agree on, whether you prefer the Legends continuity or the Disney continuity, what we can all agree on are two things. Number one, Dave Filoni is an incredible writer. He deserves so much credit for what he was able to take as a source material, expand upon it, and give us an enjoyable experience. I believe Dave Filoni single-handedly is carrying the modern version of Star Wars. And the second thing that we can all agree on is that the sequel trilogy is a mess of unwatchable, radioactive dog shit. We should be able to agree on both of those points. The same thing with Dragon Ball. If you stop and think about it, Dragon Ball has expanded into a multiverse. People used to say if Toriyama didn't write it down, it doesn't count. And if you take that logic, you have to ignore most of the Dragon Ball Super anime, because Toriyama does have input on the Toyotaro version of the Dragon Ball Super manga, but he didn't write the anime. He may have given vague plot points, but the creation of certain characters, Ultra Instinct Omen, Jiren being so powerful, Toriyama didn't write those. Those came in after the fact. So, are we going to say that the Super anime doesn't count because Toriyama didn't write it? Absolutely not. Why? Because Toei Animation legally has the right to sell their product as Dragon Ball, so that's the official story. Likewise, Toyotaro's manga, he legally has the right to sell that as a Dragon Ball product, so that is official as well. And like it or not, Toei Animation legally had the right to release GT as Dragon Ball material. So because of that, that means that Merge Zamasu is canon, so is Omega Shenron. Beerus is canon, so are Supreme Kai and Kibito staying fused. They're all canon. The Shadow Dragons are canon, so are the Pride Troopers. They may be different continuities, but the writers of those different series, at the time of them releasing it, they legally had the right to call their product Dragon Ball. What that means is there should not be any conflict of, oh, Super is canon, GT is not. Or GT is canon, Super is not. No, under MAMU, the theory I'm coming up with here, they're both canon. They are both canon. Toei had the right to release Dragon Ball Super just like they had the right to release Dragon Ball Z. And even if Toriyama did not write every single aspect of it, he still oversaw production on both of them, or he oversaw parts of both of them. They are both the official story of what happens in Dragon Ball. I would rather just call it the Toyotaro version of Dragon Ball and the Toei version, because they're just different versions, but they're the same multiverse. Even the movies, as goofy as they were, the writers of those movies legally had the right to call their product Dragon Ball. That means the movies are canon, under MAMU. That doesn't mean the movies are great, except the Garlic Jr. franchise, that was amazing. I loved Garlic Jr. He was the only Z villain that managed to get immortality. In him fighting Gohan, you get to see Gohan step up and be the main character for a minute. Garlic Jr. was amazing. But we have to admit this, as much as it pains us, but we have to be intellectually honest. Dragon Ball Evolution is canon. Yes, I know half of you just threw up in your throat, but we have to understand that the people who released Dragon Ball Evolution legally had the right to call their product Dragon Ball. Otherwise, Toriyama would have sued them to Kingdom Come. They legally had the right to release a product called Dragon Ball, which means that it's canon. It's in its own continuity, just like the manga is in its own continuity, the anime is in its own continuity, the movies are in their own continuity, but this is a valid continuity of Dragon Ball. There is a version of Goku out there that was King Piccolo's slave. That is so dumb, but hey, it's there. If we have to accept that that goofy Ewok special counts as acceptable Star Wars material, we have to accept the fact that Dragon Ball Evolution also counts as Dragon Ball material. Now, let me tell you the version of Dragon Ball I personally prefer. For me, the story of Dragon Ball goes Bardock, the father of Goku, then Dragon Ball, then Z, then GT, with a couple of the movies somewhere in between. That, to me, is the story of Dragon Ball. That's the story that I prefer. Do I like GT? No, but in my opinion, it's still a little better than Super, because you don't have Piccolo begging for superpowers like some kind of wimp. But if you prefer the Dragon Ball minus, then Dragon Ball, then Kai, then Super continuity, then have at it. That's the one you like. That's your preferred continuity. You have every right to prefer that continuity over the one that I prefer. I don't care, they're both official. Kai is an official Dragon Ball product, so is Z. Super is an official Dragon Ball product, so is GT. And you know what? There are aspects of both of them that are actually enjoyable. Legic is a cool assassin, clad in purple, so is it. Zamasu is an awesome villain that managed to steal a Saiyan's body, so is Baby. They are both comparable characters, and they're both comparably awesome. We don't have to toss out one to appreciate the other. But what we can all agree on, as Dragon Ball fans, is Orange Piccolo was a bad move. Piccolo, the character that trains all the time, that tries to light a fire under Gohan's butt to be more determined, is now wishing for powers. That's a lazy way to make him stronger. You see, one of the things that I have a huge complaint about in the Dragon Ball franchise is how Divine Ki is used. You would think Piccolo, a character who literally absorbed a Namekian deity, would be able to just have this kind of ki and just transform into Orange Piccolo at will. But when you have him wishing for power, it makes him look weak. And Piccolo is my favorite character in Z. It is so sad to see how far he has fallen. But the last on my way out comment I will make is with Halo. You've got two different continuities. You've got the Bungie continuity and the 343 continuity. In the Bungie continuity, you have the older books, and in the 343 continuity, you have the newer books. These are not the same characters. These books contradict each other. It's just two different versions. But let's just appreciate the art for what it has to offer and stop hating on each other for what version we like. Because under MAMU, all of these are official Halo materials. They're just in different continuities. There's Master Chief 1, who is a stoic character who is very strong, and then there's Master Chief 2, who's crying like a baby because his little Cortana broke. Two different continuities. Let's just enjoy the ride.